Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to continue talking about the CNS, the central nervous system, and specifically the spinal cord. But then we're going to move into the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, and talk about some of our nerves and how our nerves, our PNS and our CNS actually interact with one another to get the effects that we want to produce in our bodies. Alrighty, so here we go. So again, our spinal cord is part of the central nervous system along with the brain. Um, so some of this is a review from anatomy. So our spinal cord is continuous with the brain stem and extends all the way down through the vertebral canal. Two vital functions with the spinal cord. It is the neuronal link between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. And it's the integrating center for the spinal reflexes. So that means the reflexes that occur from the nerves that branch off of our spinal cord. Okay, so again, just a little bit of review from anatomy. There are 31 pairs of the spinal nerves, and they're named according to the region of the vertebral column from which they emerge. So remember, we've got 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. And they always come in a pair. They branch off to the left and right in order to service the left and right side of our body. All right. And just like we saw with the brain, so it's also true of the spinal cord. Again, we have the physical support. So the meninges that surround the brain also extend down around the spinal cord as well. Okay, so we do have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And again, hopefully you learned all of that in anatomy. So just be aware that we still have the same protections. But you'll notice then that nerves also, like we have the cranial nerves, so those pairs of nerves I just mentioned, they also branch off of the spinal cord as well. Okay, and we have the dorsal root and the ventral root, and then those merge and form a spinal nerve as they move away. And we're going to get more in depth about that a little bit later. But then as our nerves branch off of our spinal cord, and we know exactly what area of the spinal cord they branch off from, it forms what are called dermatomes. And so dermatomes is really what's referred to as a sensory region of the skin. And that's the region that is served by a spinal nerve. And so when you have something going on in a particular area of the body, if you understand which dermatome is being affected, you can know right away what nerve is being affected. After I had a bicycle accident years ago, about 10 years ago now, wow, that's a long time ago. Weeks after the bike accident, I had pain radiating through my thumb. And I remember thinking, how I wonder if I still had a swollen vertebrae disc around C6, because that was the dermatome C6 around the thumb area. And sure enough, I went to the doctor and he said, yeah, you have your C6 is swollen. And I went, oh, I called it. It's always kind of fun when you know what you're talking about. So since we're talking about nerves, let's do a little bit of a review. Again, this should have been a review from anatomy. I'm just going to zoom in on this for you. So remember that a nerve is actually a bundle of axons from several neurons, okay? And so those axons, remember, and the bundles are actually surrounded by different types of either cells or tissues. So we already learned when we looked at a single neuron that the axon frequently is surrounded by a myelin sheath. And that covers right over the top of the axon itself. And that sheath, if we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, then that's formed by the Schwann cells. And since nerves are part of the peripheral system, then they're always formed by the Schwann cells. Okay, and then just outside of that, there's a connective tissue covering called the endoneurium. So that covers the axon. And again, if it's myelinated axon, then it covers over the top of the myelin. And so then bundles of axons can kind of stick together with that endoneurium, and then we cover that whole bundle with perineurium. And so that's what you see, that first bundle kind of sticking out there. It's got one axon sticking out, and now there's a bundle sticking out, and that bundle is referred to as a fascicle. Okay. And then several fascicles can actually bundle together, and we wrap that whole thing with epineurium. So the very outer covering, the purple outer covering around the whole entire structure there, is the epineurium. And that's a connective tissue covering as well. So again, you've got axons covered by the myelin sheath, which is surrounded by endoneurium. Several axons then bundle together, surrounded by perineurium, and that bundle forms a fascicle. And then several fascicles can bundle together, which are all wrapped in epineurium along the outside, and that is called a nerve. So a fascicle can be a functional area, different functional area of the nerve, because a nerve can have both sensory and motor aspects to it. But remember that axons can only have action potentials that travel in one direction. So then an entire nerve can have portions of the nerve be either sensory or motor, and that's because the fascicle bundles there might be one bundle that's all sensory and another bundle that's all motor. And so that's why different nerves might be totally a sensory nerve, totally a motor nerve, or they might be both. And you might remember having to learn that in anatomy. So it's good to review that and kind of remember your anatomy. So that's the nerve itself. The spinal cord, remember, just like the brain, it's arranged in gray and white matter. The gray matter being the concentration of the cell bodies of the neurons, and the white matter being the axons of those same neurons. And so here we can see in the spinal cord, the gray matter is in the deepest portion of the spinal cord, and it kind of has that butterfly shape to it. There's a hole in the middle called the central canal. And on the dorsal side of the spinal cord of the gray matter, we have the dorsal horns, and those are the cell bodies of interneurons on which afferent neurons terminate. So the afferent neurons terminate there. The complete on the other side, we'll go down to the pink area there. That is the ventral side of the spinal cord. And so that's where cell bodies are located of the somatic efferent neurons. Efferent, okay, motor. And so that's on the ventral side. And then in the middle, the lateral horn, these are the cell bodies of the efferent nerves that go to our organs. So that's the autonomic efferent nerves. So the lateral horns are really more toward the ventral side. You can think of the whole ventral side as efferent, and the dorsal side is afferent. Okay, so if you recall from class, we talked about that the sensory nerve is an afferent nerve and a motor nerve is an efferent nerve, so that's same. Well, now we also have same, meaning S-A-M-E, S for sensory, A for afferent, and then M for motor and E for efferent. That's how you remember those. We also can now put another word on there, Dave, D-A-V-E, because the dorsal side is afferent and the ventral side is efferent. So D for dorsal, A for afferent, and V for ventral, and E for efferent. But then, okay, you forgot what afferent and efferent were, so just remember same. So just always remember that Dave is the same. So that's something to write down. Have a little note when you're taking a test. Alrighty, so remember which side of your spinal cord is afferent and efferent, because that's going to be important. What we're going to do is look at pathways of nerves and which organs that they innervate. So we need to know, or if we're receiving sensory information. So we need to know the functional areas of the spinal cord. Okay. Here's another way of looking at it, the cross section. So now we can kind of put together the motor and sensory and motor aspects of it. So over there on the right side, you can see the skin, and it's got a sensory receptor in there. So that means the skin felt something, and that feeling gets translated by the receptor being stimulated by maybe touch or heat, something like that. An action potential is then running toward the central nervous system. So that's a sensory nerve or an afferent nerve. It travels through the dorsal root ganglion. So those are ganglia on the dorsal side that contains the cell body of the afferent nerve. And then that continues to branch into the dorsal root and end at a synapse in the dorsal horn. Okay. It usually then will synapse. It might even extend toward the cell body on the other side there and synapse with a motor neuron or an efferent neuron. There's usually an interneuron in between those two. They didn't draw it there. But on the ventral side, here you can see we're starting in the ventral horn with the cell body of an efferent nerve. That efferent axon extends through the ventral root and then extends into the spinal nerve, and that spinal nerve on this one is carrying both the afferent axon and the efferent axon, and then they might branch, and the branching for the efferent axon will head towards skeletal muscle, where it synapses with the skeletal muscle, and that's your effector, and you'll get a response from your skeletal muscle. So let's say if that was something hot, the sensory perception that came in, it travels through the dorsal side, through the afferent pathway, into the dorsal horn, and then out the ventral horn with a new nerve, a motor nerve, traveling out the efferent axon through the spinal nerve, which will branch to the effector. And maybe that effector is your biceps brachii, causing you to pull your arm away from that heat. Now, there can also be a branching of that sensory axon. Remember that we saw that axons can also branch and have different synapses. And so that axon then may branch and go into the white matter of the spinal cord, forming an ascending tract traveling to your brain. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And that's where the brain processes and realizes, oh, we just touched something hot. Okay, but the movement occurred before your brain got involved. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Here's another view of what we just talked about. It doesn't show the skin or the muscle in this view, but it does show that interneuron. So everything that I have boxed in here, I would like you to know those parts of the neuron. Again, that's partly anatomy, but we're layering the functional aspect onto it. So again, in the blue, you see that's the sensory nerve or the afferent nerve. The cell body of that afferent nerve is in the dorsal root ganglion. It continues then, the axon continues through the dorsal root and enters the dorsal horn, where there is a interneuron. You should know that's a dorsal horn. I had that boxed out in the previous slide. Okay, that interneuron then synapses with the motor neuron in the ventral horn, comes out the ventral root. There is no ventral ganglion, so this efferent nerve axon is actually traveling on the outside next to that dorsal root ganglion. So there's no ventral ganglion, but it merges with the spinal nerve and heads to the effector. And here's a little bit more on the white matter of the spinal cord. So the white matter, again, is arranged into ascending and descending tracts. Those tracts are just bundles of nerve fibers, or the axons, that are branching to bring that information. If it's a sensory axon, it's an ascending tract, bringing the information up to the brain, toward the cortex, so that the cortex can determine what happened. And then sometimes we have other voluntary movements where the cortex then has descending tracts, the axons originating in the brain cortex, in order to produce a voluntary movement So those axons have action potentials traveling down through the descending tracts out of spinal nerve in order to get the voluntary muscle movement that you might experience. So for the white matter, I just want you to remember that there are ascending tracts and descending tracts, and what that means. It's the what direction the axons are traveling. And so that tells you if you have sensory or motor neurons in that area. And here's another picture of that, kind of putting the brain inside of there so that you can see the pathway of the ascending tracts and the descending tracts. Again, ascending tracts are going to start at a sensory receptor somewhere in the peripheral regions of your body, enter through the spinal cord, through the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal root into the dorsal horn, and then it can branch upward through an ascending tract of the spinal cord and synapse in the cortex, usually in the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe, where again processing can take place, which we learned in the previous lecture. If a motor response, a voluntary motor response, is being generated, then that will come from the cell body, will start in the cortex of the frontal gyrus in the frontal lobe and head down the descending tract through the white matter of the brain, through the white matter of the spinal cord, out the ventral root into a spinal nerve, and then synapse on usually a skeletal muscle. If we were, of course, a skeletal muscle if we're doing a voluntary movement of our skeletal muscles. Okay, so that's when the brain is involved. But remember that the brain isn't always involved in our movements. It can sometimes only involve the spinal cord. And that's what we refer to about as a simple reflex. So a reflex in and of itself is an automatic patterned response to a stimulus. There's no conscious effort to this. If you are in the lab, we've been studying this. We studied this last week. And so there are two types of reflexes. Again, we're going to study the simple reflex. This is a built-in unlearned response, such like you touch something hot and you automatically pull your hand away. And that only involves the spinal cord and sometimes the brain stem. But there's no higher level brain activity going on here, such as the cortex. That's not needed. Okay. There is another type of a reflex referred to as an acquired reflex, or sometimes called a conditioned reflex. And this does require other brain processes. It's the result of practice and learning. So for example, when you're learning to play a song on the piano, or if you're learning how to dance and you're learning different movements, there's a lot of higher brain thought process going on at first. And then you can, as you start to remember those and develop a pattern memory, that gets stored in the cerebellum. And so there's not conscious thought going on anymore. And so you can automatically do those movements without really, like in the case of the piano, having to read every note. Okay, that's how that works. So those are higher brain levels that are needed. We're going to focus on the simple reflex right now. And that's something referred to as the reflex arc. And the arc is referring to the actual pattern of neurons that occur through nerves, through your peripheral system and your central nervous system. Okay, and so there's always 5 components that are involved in a reflex arc. Yes, you should know the 5 components. So it starts with the receptor. That receptor then is going to be connected to an afferent pathway, which is your afferent nerve or sensory nerve, right? That's going to synapse within the integration center, which is the CNS, and this will be the spinal cord. There may or may not be an interneuron in that area. And we'll discuss when there is and when there isn't. But in either case, the synapse will occur there. A synapse will occur with a motor neuron or an efferent neuron, and that forms our efferent pathway. And that axon then will extend to an effector, which is usually a muscle or it could be a gland, in order to produce the response that we're looking for. So before I get into more detail in this, we're using the term receptor. And this receptor is a little bit different than the receptors that we talked about in the previous lecture, talking about receptors receiving neurotransmitters or hormones on cell membranes. Okay, so this receptor is a little bit different, and it's still called a receptor because it's receiving something, right? So you may have learned about these in anatomy. And so here's a nice picture showing different types of somatosensory receptors. This happens to be, these receptors are embedded in the skin, and you can see that they're nerve endings, but they usually have connective tissue wrapped around them, and they're located, in this case, in the skin, in different levels of the skin. So I'm not going to test you on this again, but you just might remember from anatomy Pacinian corpuscles and Meissner's corpuscles and Ruffini corpuscles, Merkel discs, right? And sometimes they don't have connective tissue endings on the end, and those are just free nerve endings. Those are just the ends of dendrites that are scattered throughout the different layers in the epithelium. Okay, and so each of these are going to sense something different. Here's another way of looking at those types of receptors, those somatosensory receptors. So these are just the nerves themselves, not associated with the body. So again, it's usually at the end of a neuron, but it's the other end, it's the dendritic end. And the ends of those dendrites are the receptor. So again, in A, you can have the free nerve ending, or you can have different layers of connective tissue surrounding that nerve ending, as you can see in B, C, and D. And again, that's just going to have a different receptor type reacting to a different stimulus. Okay, so the point here is that, as it says here, receptors are specific. That means that they will only respond to a specific type of stimulus. We call that the adequate stimulus. So what does that mean? Some of our receptors are mechanoreceptors. They respond to a physical pressure. So your mechanoreceptors in your skin, when somebody pokes you, that's a mechanoreceptor that is being stimulated by that poke. And again, we talked about this briefly in a previous lecture, actually the last unit, that mechanoreceptor will have ion channels that open because of the pressure pushing on them. So if enough sodium enters and you reach threshold, then you've stimulated that sensory nerve. Okay, I put in a sub bullet point there, a baroreceptor, because those are receptors associated in our blood vessels to sense blood pressure. So it's still a mechanoreceptor, but the pressure it's responding to is coming from the pressure of fluid. Okay, if it's temperature, then temperature, a thermoreceptor can be stimulated by heat or lack thereof. And so the heat is going to open the receptor and bring it to threshold. If there is no heat and it doesn't open it, then that's the brain actually interprets that as cold. Okay, so we really don't have a receptor to feel cold, but all we know, our brain interprets it, the lack of heat, as cold. Photoreceptors in our eyes, they open ion channels based on light stimulating them. Chemoreceptors, that's a chemical that can stimulate those. And nociceptors are a specific type of receptor that can be associated with any of these types, but it's when there's an overstimulation of those types and we interpret it as pain. So if the nociceptor is stimulated, then our brain interprets that as pain. Okay, so a little bit different type of receptor than what we've been talking about. So I wanted to make sure you understand that. So going along with our reflex arc, we can put all of this together. We said that step number 1, there has to be a receptor. And that's what you see at number 1 there. In this one case happens to be a thermoreceptor in our finger. The stimulus is something hot. It's hot enough that it stimulates the thermoreceptor, and it means the axon then gets stimulated to threshold, and we have an action potential running up our afferent nerve, right? And that's step 2, the afferent nerve. We have to have that. That travels then into our spinal cord, and it synapses. In this case, it synapses with, you can see the little green one in there, an A. It synapses with a interneuron, and then that synapses with a motor neuron, and that motor neuron then causes an action potential to stimulate our biceps brachii to contract, and that pulls our hand away. Now, it took me so much longer to explain that than what would actually happen. That would be a split second, and you would pull your hand away before you even knew what was happening in your brain, before your brain is able to interpret what happens. You can see that the sensory nerve can branch, and again, that branching, the interneuron then can send a signal up the ascending tracts to the brain, and the brain then will interpret, oh, we just touched something hot. Maybe we should turn off that burner, or we should just be more careful next time. Right? But if we had to get our brain activity in before to tell our bicep brachii to contract, then we would do damage to our hand. That pathway would be much slower than it would with the simple reflex arc. And reflex arcs, the main pathway is always the same, but again, they can get a little more complex. This one's called a cross-extensor reflex, and it's coupled with a withdrawal reflex. So if you step on a tack, again, you have a receptor, the pain receptor is stimulated. That's step 1. Step 2, we've stimulated a sensory nerve. That sensory nerve synapses in the integrating center. That's step 3 in the spinal cord. That might either synapse with an interneuron. In this case, it does not. It actually synapses directly with a motor neuron. That's step 4. And that motor neuron synapses with the muscles in our quadriceps, and it causes those to contract, and we lift up our foot, okay, to get away from the painful stimulus. That's the reflex arc. So the effector is the muscle. That's step 5. But there is also another pathway that occurs at the same time to cause our other leg to contract to be able to stand on one foot. Because if you lift up the foot that was in pain, you could just fall over. So we do have some, this is why it's called a cross-extensor reflex. It crosses over to the other side to allow us to stabilize the other leg so that we can lift up that foot. Okay. The most simplest reflex is a monosynaptic stretch reflex. This is the reflex. A good example is in your patellar tendon. You can have reflexes in your elbow and other areas of the body. It's present in all muscles, but most dramatic in the extensor muscles of your limbs. So in here, the receptor is referred to as a spindle, and the spindles are receptors, stretch receptors embedded, in this case, since we're talking about the patellar reflex, they're embedded in your quadricep muscles. And the stimulus is striking the patellar ligament. So you can see that right below your patella, you strike the ligament there. That causes stretching of the tendon above, because that's connected over the patella down to the ligament below where you struck it. That stretches the spindles, which are the receptors. Those spindles then stimulate the sensory neuron, which then is integrated in the spinal cord, and that integration is a direct synapse with a motor neuron. Okay, and that motor neuron then forms a nerve that travels all the way to your quadriceps muscles to cause them to contract, and you kick your leg. Okay, so that is a stretch reflex because it originally started with a slight stretching from the banging of the patellar hammer, and stretching the receptors in your quadricep muscles. So that's caused that whole reflex arc to react. And we have the 5 steps in there. It's called monosynaptic because there's one synapse between the sensory synaptic ending and the motor cell body. There's one synapse in there. There's no interneuron here. That's monosynaptic. The previous ones I showed you were disynaptic because there were 2 synapses from the sensory neuron to the interneuron in the spinal cord, and then the interneuron to the motor neuron. So that's 2 synapses in that pathway. So make sure you can understand that difference between a monosynaptic reflex and a disynaptic reflex. Let me show you a little more detail on the receptor in this type of reflex, the spindle in your muscle. Here's a close-up of the spindle. And what we've done is you can kind of see the white edges along the side. If you look at the line connecting it, it'll show you that that's a connective tissue sheath. So they took that connective tissue and they cut it open, revealing the spindle on the inside. So the spindle on the inside is the actual stretch receptor, and it's a collection of specialized muscle cells called intrafusal fibers. Intrafusal fibers. So those fibers are associated with their own set of nerves that can sense that stretch that came from the banging of the patellar reflex. Okay, so those intrafusal fibers, once they get stretched from that banging, then that's what sends that sensory, stimulates that sensory nerve, then going down our sensory pathway, heading to the spinal cord, which then synapses with the motor neuron, and the motor neuron then stimulates the other cells of our quadricep muscle, which are known as extrafusal fibers, causing them to contract. And in the next lecture, we'll actually learn, or 2 lectures from now, we'll learn about, 2 videos from now, we'll learn about how our muscle cells actually contract. Okay, so just be aware that the spindle, muscle spindle, is a stretch receptor, and that's what's stimulating the afferent nerve. Okay, so why do we have stretch reflexes? Somebody asked me this in lab, so I wanted to make sure I put it in here. The primary purpose of the knee jerk reflex is to resist the tendency for any kind of passive stretch of our extensor muscles, because gravity is always kind of pulling us down when we're just standing upright. And so you don't want to fall down. And so this stretch reflex is kind of constantly telling our body to automatically contract certain muscle fibers so that we can stand upright and we don't fall down, right? But then we can use that as a test to make sure that our reflexes and our nervous system is working correctly, right? So it's a very easy test for doctors to be able to do. And so you can see that we can test different areas of the neuromuscular system. In the arm, it resists counteracting a load. So when you pick something up, that stretch reflex will automatically cause contraction so that you don't drop whatever is in your hand. Alrighty? So that brings us to the efferent system, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, but let's start a new video because this is about a half hour, so we'll start the part 2 of this video in just a moment. Thank you.